up and he got us going and helped us out. And he used to be Galambos' electrician. And he knew him. He's got a lot of anecdotes. We'll get you recorded tomorrow. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that the work now is finished. It's ready to go to the ages. And I'm announcing again that it is published now. And I don't want to steal Galambos' thunder. What you do is you come and look at it and read it. And that pretty much concludes what I wanted to say. Give you a little bit of history of how this was done. Here's the miserable lawsuit against me by Galambos' enemies who are now squatting on his assets and hiding behind the California probate code. In here, I'll read to you something that'll make you all... what's a nice word, Dr. Orr, for throwing up? Vomit, okay. Get your buckets out. Here's let me see if I can find this. When you hear this, you won't believe it. You all know that Galambos did not have a very, he had a jaundiced view about committees.
Are you looking for the changes he wants to make to the trust?
Yeah.
In the very back.
In the very back. Okay, thank you, Eric. God, what would I do without Eric? See, Galambos got me in the 0 to 1 transition. Before he died, he knew I was his man. I remember, forget, in January of 1991, his wife called me in a very distraught condition, and she said, well, here, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to read that to you before I get to this. You need to hear it. I've never said, I kept this private. I said I was never going to disclose this, but in view of what's happened in history, and since Galambos told me that I should not keep this as a confidence, and he was very distraught when he told me this, I'll read it to you. How many of you know where this quote comes from, by the way? O judgment, thou art fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason. Huh? Yeah, Shakespeare, all right. You know, which play? It's what Mark Antony said in his frustration over the people that had murdered Julius Caesar. I threw that in there. Probably so, Eric. God, I hope somebody else will do it besides me. Oh, Jesus. Can you imagine? Can you imagine indexing what we did here? Let me tell you how I did it. I invented a process here. I'd take a blue pen, and I would go down, I'd read it. Furthermore, against a formal declaration to the court and I would put down 1, court, a formal declaration against in the margin. So Eric would see the entry over here. He'd go over here to see where it was in the text. He puts the text up on the screen, types the index entry in, and codes it. And then we go down to the next page. Galambos' trust. Okay, there's another entry. By the time you get through, you got 150 to 100 index entries on every page. But now, you know, you have it all. Now let's see if I can find this. And bear with me. Oh yeah, we had a motto. We had a motto. 4 words. Shakespeare. You want to hear it? I commend it to all of you. Take pains, semicolon. Be perfect. Take pains, be perfect. What the hell was I looking for?
1991, Mrs. Galambos.
Thank you. Indispensable. Okay, 1991. Here we go. Where is it? It's in the history here. Yes. Eric or Warren, can you put the screen up on the corporation chart? It's about time I talk about that for a few minutes. Eric, you want to find that for me, please? I can't find this shit. And then I'll read something to you that you all need to know. And what a horrible, horrible consequence it was to Galambos through his market, who betrayed him. For those of you who have had V201, this is called the primary mechanism. This arrangement of business procedures does away with the stock market once and for all. It does away with the stock company. It does away with voting stock. It does away with the entire financial structuring in the United States and in Europe and all over the world. It does away with it completely. For your information, the person who's really in charge of this whole operation here is the E over here, up here, to the left of the P1 company. He's the entrepreneur who is running everything. The P1 company, P1 stands for intellectual property. P2 company stands for tangible assets like machinery and equipment, bricks and steel, cash in the bank, cars, clothes, you name it. The operating company is just a company that's used to manufacture a product. Galambos took a word to represent any product, and he called it a squibble duck. The beautiful thing about this is, and it's so revolutionary, is that at the very top, where you see the eyes up there, those are the innovators. Those are the ones who produce the scientific discoveries and the inventions that lead down to the company that the entrepreneur who's managing the ideas will use in order to produce whatever product that comes down out of the operating company down here. To raise the money to do that, you create a P2 company. P2 stands for money in all tangible forms of property. Okay, and the S's up there are not innovators, they are shareholders. They're capital suppliers, money investors, called shareholders. The P2 company over here is run by a P1 company, like here, with an entrepreneur running that up on the top. He runs the company that runs the P2 company, the investment company. Now you can see here that you have P1 and P2 coming together in the black line between the two boxes there, where you have the ideas being fed into and joining the flow of the P2, or the money that's financing the operation. All of which is controlled at all times by this entrepreneur over here. But he negotiates with the entrepreneur, the P1 company running the P2 company, for a split of the actual net revenue coming up after expenses of the operating company. And the Y split, you can see that in the red, goes over there and flows back up to the shareholders. And you get a flow of money coming back, or net revenue flowing back. That's the X split coming back to the entrepreneur over here. And the fantastic thing about this is that the shareholders in the P2 company, once they make their money available to the P2 company, which then, through the P1E of the P2 company, makes that available for this project here, the Scribble Duck project. Once that money is put into the hands of the P1E over here, the investors, the shareholders of the P2 company can never get that money back. They can never claim it back. They can't operate, they can't interfere with the entrepreneurial activities here. What they are entitled to is a return called a revenue share over a certain base period, which might be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, for the return of their original capital, but it doesn't end with that. It continues indefinitely, beyond their lives. It goes to their natural estates so long as there is money coming from the selling of the product that they financed. This separates the entrepreneurial function from the capitalist's supply of money function. And the control of the entire operation is over here on the E side. Now, when Galambos set up his trust, he said, I want to have a trustee for the management of my assets of my estate. And I'm creating a literary executor to fulfill the purpose of my trust. And the purpose of that trust is to perpetuate, to protect, and to publish their literary works. Period. That is the function. And to create a museum. But as an afterthought. All right? Now, according to Galambos' theory here, the P1E is in complete charge of everything. And believe me, when Hayes and Joyner saw Schedule B of that trust, they realized that if James, right here, James Gafford, the first name literary executor, found out about that, that could be awful, because James Gafford or I would say, hey, wait a minute, you guys, hey, you're trying to tell me what to do here. You have no control over this. Here's the chapter and verse in Galambos' theory. Did you find it?
Yeah, I found it. It's on page 22.
Okay, would you bring it here and I'll read that? And I also I want to read you concerning this text here.
Starts right there.
Okay, thanks, Eric. All right. Now let me show you. Now you follow me on this chart. Follow the chart now. I'm going to read you something straight from Galambos' theory, which bears upon what's happening in this room. He uses these diagrams, he uses arrows to talk about the things he's talking about here. But here's what he says. Today's businessmen do not qualify for what I'm going to call here the P1E. Right behind me. This person here, and he's pointing to the box on the left there. This person here, who's the entrepreneur or the head entrepreneur of the P1 company, will be referred to as the P1E. And you see it there on the chart, P1E. The reason for that is there are also entrepreneurs elsewhere in this here. There's one over here too. That would be an Eric Falvey working in the operating company down here. You see there are entrepreneurs there. All right? That would be the P2E, chuckles from the audience in AGG. This one is the significant person for this company. He's talking about the P1E. You may say, oh, there are 3 companies here. P1 company, P2 company, operating company. Yes, but only one product. And that product's management, listen to this, from beginning to end depends on this one. And there's an arrow here, right there, pointing to the P1E. From beginning to end, the entire production of the Scribble Duck project here is based upon the P1E. All right. And then I write, Galambos further emphasized this point when discussing the authority of the P2E. Look up there on the chart. Where's the P2E? He's over on the right-hand side there. And his relationship with the P1E. Now, I'm going to tell you right now that the P2E over there would be the equivalent of the trustee of Galambos' estate who's handling conventionally his assets. The P1E is something that has never existed before in any kind of corporate structure, any kind of business structure, any testamentary plan. And that's the P1E over here. So Galambos separated it out, and he semantically distinguished it. He called it his literary agent, literary executor acting as his literary agent. And since the purpose of the trust was to perpetuate and to publish and make distributions to of their literary properties, that's primary property. The Scribble Duck is what? What do you think the Scribble Duck here is in this context? Pretty obvious. Right here, Sic Itur Astra. That's the book. All right? Now, with all that in mind, listen to this. Early in V50, he anticipated wait a minute. Yeah. Galambos further emphasized this point when discussing the authority of the P2E and his relationship with the P1E. The relationship of the trustee of Galambos' estate to Galambos' literary executor. Here's what he said. I quote from V201, Session 25, Part A, Volume 4, page 253. You can come up here and look this up here. Go read it in the text for yourself. But I have a quote. It's in black highlighted text. And here's what he says. The only decision he makes, the entrepreneur of the P2 company, Galambos' trustee of the tangible assets, the only decision he makes is whether or not he makes P2, money, available to a given P1E for a given scribble duck, a given operating company. Once that decision is made affirmatively, there is no further interference with what happens to that company or its products. That's what they were afraid of. That's why they said, well, we don't recognize the authority of the literary executor. We don't even know what it means. What does it mean to edit? I mean, aren't there any instructions? I mean, we don't know what that means. So they kept that from you, James, and they kept it from me. Fortunately, I was working with Mrs. Galambos to get their estate of planning affairs in order, and I orchestrated the creation of that trust. And the attorney knew me well, so he gave me a copy. When I walked into Joyner's office and said, hey, you know what? I'm the literary executor. I'm the P1E here. What the hell do you guys think you're doing? He said, well, we don't know what that means, and there's no provision in the California Probate Code to authorize the affairs of a literary executor. Tens of thousands of statutes in the California Probate Code, and there's not one goddamn mention of a literary executor in it. Think about that. Is that not a commentary on how bereft and shallow this state is intellectually? Massachusetts has it. New York has it. Lots of other states have recognition of literary executors. In fact, if you look up the dictionary, I rubbed the new collegiate dictionary in their noses, and I said, you guys don't know what a literary executor is? Here, God damn it, here. Right here in the dictionary is the definition of a literary executor, and it was coined in 1865 in America, for your information. It says so right here. That means one who is entrusted with the management of a deceased author's literary properties. And you guys don't know what it means. Well, the probate code doesn't, you're a stranger to the court, and I said, okay, well, we'll see. And I tried to get standing in the court, but the judge said, well, you were right. You're a stranger to the court. There's no provision in the California Probate Code for a literary executor. I'm sorry, sir, we cannot grant you the what you asked for, namely an accounting of the affairs of the trust on the part of the trustee. Because I was going to go after them. I was going to get them removed for nonfeasance. That means you're not doing something that you should do. And malfeasance, which means you're doing something you shouldn't do. I thought I could get them removed until a high-ranking lawyer told me, he says, judges don't remove fiduciaries. You got to be dead to be removed. They want to be fair. They want to make you all work together. And I says, no, I'm not going to submit Galambos' works to a damn flatland judge who's going to tell me what the right price is and when we're going to publish and all the terms of my business. Baloney. I'll skip. And then I went to the market. I went to Galambos' market and I said, here's what Galambos says. Big mouth technique. You go after him and you pour it on. You spread the word. And you can be very important. This will be the most difficult lesson you'll ever learn in your life, Galambos said, and I'm quoting that. And he says, the trouble with you is you can't do that. You think you're so insignificant. But look what I did. I went after the Ford Motor Company. He said, if you multiply my example by just 1,000 people, you know what, over a 10-year period, how much that would cost Ford Motor Company in sales? It was over $1 billion. That shows you the potency of the individual. And so he says, I recommend to you not to sue people. You're going to the state. You're patronizing the state. You're giving advertisement of your compromise with coercion. No, don't sue. Even if you win, it's a Pyrrhic victory and it's not good for your morale. You bring market justice to bear upon your opponents. So what did I do? I wrote a letter on April 8th, 1999 to all of you and to all of Galambos' market. And I said, this is what we do and this is why, and I quoted Galambos. And guess what? Everybody had a collective ego collapse. Who the hell does this damn Martin guy think he is telling us what we're going to do? That's what happened. And Galambos was right. It truly was a top inquisition. It was the top tests and the biggest filters that would ever come to his market. And he predicted in advance they would all fail. And he was so right. There would only be a remnant who would make it. And you're that. You and about 6 other people. That's it. And yet it's a huge, huge thing. Remember, Bruno got nobody. Archimedes got nobody. I got Eric. Galambos got me. I got Pete. I got Martin Atkins here. You know, I got Pete back here. I got Gafford. And I've got the rest of you. Now, continuing with this here, so we finish that up. He says earlier in V50, Galambos anticipated the principle of non-interference with the management of a company by its shareholders. There's your shareholders over there. And I quote, V50, Session 16, Part B, page 899. A public stockholder. Now he's talking Flatland here now. A public stockholder has no business running the company or having anything to say about how that company is run, even if he has voting stock as a shareholder. Why? It's immoral. He hasn't taken a proprietary risk in the entrepreneurship of that company. Galambos said that's an Olympian attitude, and that is wrong, and it is malignant. You don't do it. He erased even the possibility of that with this revolutionary schematic, which he calls his primary mechanism, which is the strongest part of the integrity machine, which is the totality of all the revolutionary principles, definitions, technologies, etc. of V201. Now, the last quote. As for the right of the literary executor to dissociate from the co-trusteeship of Hayes and Joyner, Galambos had this to say, quote, one of the things, now look at their schematic now, so you follow now. One of the things about the contract between the P1 and P2 companies will be that if the P2 company's management changes, the contract is terminated. Unless the P1E, literary executor now in our case at hand, unless the P1 accepts the new P2 management. Well, I don't accept it. And therefore, I have the support of Galambos' theory of going my own way on this. Now, on page 20, what did you say, Eric? 22. Here's what Galambos said to me. This is very private information. Nobody else has ever heard this before. It happened, and I'll read it to you. On Saturday, 1991, January 19th, at about 6 in the evening, this was 12 years ago, Mrs. Galambos called to tell me that her husband, she thought, wanted to make me his, quote, literary executor, end quote. They accused me of inventing that term and putting it in Galambos' estate. It's not true. I've heard it for the first time from Mrs. Galambos when she called me this night. And that he would be calling me for this purpose. Her voice was anxious and agitated. When I asked her if he had meant now, meaning, you mean he wants me to be his literary executor now? Which I thought he did. She paused for a moment, then replied that she and her husband weren't going to last indefinitely. That was an evasion. And I knew it, and it was awkward on the phone. I replied that in that case, he must not have meant, as she had just said, that he wanted me to be his literary executor, but that he wanted me to be successor literary executor to herself. She was silent for a moment, then changed the subject, saying that she wanted to bring her husband to my office, where a then associate of mine, whom I had referred to her, was then finishing up the typesetting of a biography she had written of her husband's father called More Lasting Than Bronze. The visit never happened. Okay, now over here, I say, on Friday 1991, March 29th, Galambos called me at 6:30 p.m. I'm leaving California, he said. I'm fed up with California, I'm moving to New York next year or the year after. He then spoke at length about his army days during and just after the war, the greatness of his father, his crossings of the Atlantic on the Queen Elizabeth Britannic, a diesel ship, and the Aquitania, and his trip to Budapest in June of last year. Quotes, unquotes, and quotes, unquotes. After which, listen to this, here we go. After which, he confided that he had made a mistake in not marrying his first fiancée, Janet Swanson, and repeated that he wanted me to go with him to Sacramento to see the governor for getting revenge against Mr. McKay of the Santa Ana Department of Motor Vehicles. His speech, I later wrote in my diary, was, quote, punctuated by violence, to wit, Wilbur Wright created the aeroplane, Orville Wright was a jerk. And we say, that's hyperbole until you think about it. Orville Wright never admitted that it was his brother who invented the aeroplane and that he was an able mechanical assistant. That's why Galambos said that. And, he said, Calhoun, you all know who he was? John Calhoun. Footnote, 1782 to 1850, American politician, Vice President of the United States, 1825 to 32. And Calhoun was another jackass. So I looked up Calhoun. Yeah, Galambos, you're right. You're really right about that. He ended his telephone call at 9:10 p.m. I always kept a record. Whenever the phone rang, I took my scratch pad with me. I took notes, and I wrote down everything I could, knowing that I had a sense of history here, that this probably would come to light someday and would be very valuable to posterity. The next time I spoke, there's a footnote on Janet Swanson, in case any of you would like to know who she was. On 1989, March 5th, during the second half of session 196 of OEC, that's his open-end course, Galambos described the terms of his prospective marriage with Miss Swanson. This is on tape. This is on tape. If I had access to Galambos' assets, which I have every right to have, I would play it for you. Their children, he said, he was going to marry this Swanson. She was a Lutheran girl, not a Jew. Their children, he said, were to be, quote, 100% Jews, end quote, and they would get married, quote, after the war, end quote. He subsequently wrote Miss Swanson a letter calling off the engagement on the grounds that she was 3 years older than he was and that her background was Lutheran. Then, to his audience, he publicly confessed on tape, quote, why didn't I marry her? Because I'm a damn fool. I loved her. I more than loved her, end quote. His wife was not in attendance that day. Just so happens to be. She wasn't there. Okay. All right. The next time I spoke with Galambos, this is very personal, intimate stuff here. I'm sharing it with you. You deserve to hear it. And you need to know it. The next time I spoke with Galambos was on the 14th of April. He talked from 6 p.m. to 6:40 p.m. Again, he asked me to go to Sacramento with him to see Governor Wilson about his driver's license. It had been taken away from him. He was getting Alzheimer's. He ran over and killed a Mexican. And they took his driver's license away. He couldn't pass the driver's license. Were you there? You were there, James, weren't you? I was there. Martin, you were there. He couldn't pass the test. He couldn't process the information. He was sinking pretty fast. However, in his dementia, I cannot tell you how many things I got from him that I would never in a million years gotten from him when he was totally sound. And the reason can be likened to a man whose tongue has been loosened by wine. And you get truth. And here's what he said. And he had moments of unbelievable clarity. And I learned from it, as you'll hear. He sometimes couldn't finish his sentences. Twice, he stuttered uncontrollably, like this. Like that. Pause. I'm sorry. I'm excited. And I heard it, and it made me want to cry. He also brought up the subject of his cousin again. No, I'm sorry. Twice he stuttered uncontrollably. But like earlier, he calmed down, apologized for his stuttering, and lectured to me about justice for Hungary, which was the land of his birth, about Lord Rothermere. Jesus, never heard of him before. Who's this guy? God, Jesus, I thought this guy was losing it. All of a sudden, Jesus. About Lord Rothermere, quote, I wrote this down, the great man for Hungary, end quote, who was the first to call attention to the injustices of the Treaty of Trianon. How many of you have been to Versailles? Anybody? Versailles? Muriel, you're from Paris, aren't you? Have you been to Versailles? Have you seen the Trianon Castle? It's just beyond the big, yeah. Down there was another treaty besides the Versailles Treaty in 1919 that was formulated, and it was the Treaty of Trianon that dismembered Hungary and gave its northern portion to that abomination called Czechoslovakia. It took a part of eastern Hungary and gave it to Romania, and the southern part was given to Yugoslavia, an artificially created country. More than 50% of Hungary was dismembered. It was lost. It killed the stability of that part of Europe and set the stage for World War II. And he's telling me here, he says, and then he says, who was the first to call attention to the injustice of the Treaty of Trianon, and about Kolozsvár, or Cluj, which was the birthplace of King Matyas. King Matyas in 1456, no, that was his father, János Hunyadi, or Hunyadi János, had defeated the Turks at Nagyfehérvár, which is Belgrade today. And a few years later, his great son came to power, and it was the most enlightened of all the kings in Europe. He had the largest library in Europe, and they had a golden bull, which was religious toleration. It was the first country in Europe to do it. And he's telling me these things over the phone. It chokes me up just to tell you about it. And then he says, he also brought up the subject of his cousin again. His cousin was 6 years his junior, he said, and the son of his father's brother, Arnold the doctor. Then, suddenly, changing the tone in his voice, he asked me with rising emotion if I knew why he had never had any children. No, there was an official version of that. Misdiagnosis, tipped uterus, stuff like that. And they never went back. They did find out later, many years later, that she could have had children. And Galambos said it was one of the great tragedies of my life. Now he's telling me, he's asking me the question. He's saying, then suddenly, changing the tone in his voice, he asked me with rising emotion if I knew why he had never had any children. Without waiting for a reply, he whispered bitterly, "She didn't want to have them. I should have had another one. She doesn't want to move to New York." End quote. There's the real reason. That's the real reason. His wife was one of your typical Jewesses, overwhelmed with ambition. I know this is hard. Maybe yours can't take this. I'll say it anyway. I don't give a damn. Jewish women traditionally love ambition. They are pretty cold to their children, according to my observations, and I'm pretty good at generalizing. But that's what happened here. She was more interested in her journalism, in her career of making a name for herself, and she came from a family of rabbis. Moments later, he simply hung up after wishing me good night. My last conversation with the professor took place at 10:30 in the evening on the 30th of April, 1991. His speech was disconnected. Again, he was very angry. He repeated that he wanted me to go with him to Sacramento to get Governor Wilson to reverse the revocation of his driver's license. He said he'd call back on May 10th to confirm the trip. I never heard from him again. You want to hear something sad? Listen to this. 11 months passed. Then one evening I received a telephone call from Mrs. Galambos. The date was 1992, March 14. Her husband, she said, couldn't coordinate numbers in his head. Also, he was taking long, unannounced walks. When he crossed busy boulevards, he didn't look right or left or at the lights. On 1992, May 9th, she again called me. She had tried, she said, to put her husband in a home, but was unsuccessful because he was, quote, violent at times, end quote. Then she came to the point of her call. Would I serve as alternate successor trustee on two trusts, she said. She didn't say literary, she said two trusts, one literary and the other financial. The first successor trustee for the financial trust would be Wayne Joyner, her lawyer, and I, his successor. The first successor for the literary trust, she had decided, should be James Gafford. and I his successor. She explained that she had picked Mr. Gafford over me as the first successor trustee of the literary trust because, quote, he's got a formal background in physics which neither I nor you have. I thanked her for these honors and said I would so serve. Soon after that, I received a copy of the Galambos' trust document from the attorney. The date of its execution was 1992, April 16th. Its Schedule B confirmed what Mrs. Galambos had confided to me. When I asked the attorney how Mrs. Galambos had managed to get the professor to sign the document, he replied that she had got his agreement, quote, on a good day, end quote. I did not hear again from Mrs. Galambos until the 10th of June. On that date, she thanked me for referring her to the attorney and announced that she thought she might have found a place to put her husband. It was secured but not locked and had a patio and gardens surrounded by an 8-foot wall with, quote, plenty of sunlight and fresh air and walking around space, end quote, for him. 15 days later, she called again. She called again. We spoke from 7:40 p.m. till 8 p.m. Her husband, she said, had escaped, later caught. When the nursing home she had placed him in was having a fire drill. They're having a fire drill. She says her husband walked down, saw a chance to escape, walked right out the front door and was gone. Bless his heart. Then she broke the inevitable news. Her husband had been tentatively diagnosed as a victim of Alzheimer's disease. She wanted me to know that I was the first person she had called to announce this tragic news. And she wanted me to know this before she mailed out 500 letters to the FEI market. I now quote from that letter. It was dated 1992, June 6th, and I won't read that to you, and so on. So you can see there's been a long trauma here. And freedom's destiny was hanging in the balance for a long, long time. The propulsion that he had asked for when the rocket analogy had gotten into second stage towards orbit had failed of its propulsion. Nobody had come forward to provide that. Not any of us, not even me. And it wasn't until after his death that I began to realize when I looked at this and saw that Mrs. Galambos was incompetent, I hate to say it, but it's true, wasn't able to do the job, and that's the best thing I can say. And so then the rest of it is history. When it came right down to it, Mr. Gafford, instead of weaseling around and saying, well, they were making excuses, he just flat out said, I'm not up to the task. And he manfully resigned. And I claim that on the day he did that, he was the only real man in that room. Not me. Hell, I was there to be a witness. I was actually realizing that this was necessary if I were to take over here. Because I didn't know whether James would quit. I didn't know that. I knew they were going to get him, and that they did. And I figured that I would take over and I would be able to succeed. And immediately I called Gafford. I think it was within. I can tell that story. Yeah. Okay. I called him and I called him and told him. I says, "You were really manly that day, and instead of you thinking that this was a disgrace and in the end of your life, no, it was the beginning of your life. That was the most beautiful thing you've ever done in your life. I respect you from the depths of my heart. You were a real man there. Those other scoundrels are crooks. I'm dissembling, I'm working them, I'm at war with them, and I'm selling them on the idea of preserving all this stuff." And Gafford told me later on, he was in very, very poor spirits that night when he was driving home, and he said my call to him helped save his life. So now, if you can put that back on, I'll finish up that thing about the literary executor. And Eric's directed me to the end here. Yeah, it's right here, isn't it, Eric? Is this it?
Yeah, it's one of the...
Okay. I want you to hear what Galambos' traitors, and by the way, for your information, treason. Galambos defined treason as betrayal of principle. Treachery was betrayal of trust. These guys are guilty of both. Here is their petition to the, is it Los Angeles? Yeah, I think it is. Los Angeles Superior, the Superior Court of California in Los Angeles. Here's what it says. Pursuant to paragraph 17, as amended and restated, of the trust instrument to which these bylaws are attached, the successor trustee to this trust created under Declaration of Trust dated April 16, 1992, wherein Andrew J. Galambos and Suzanne J. Galambos are trustors, or any successor trustee thereunder, quote unquote, the trust shall be a board of trustees, collectively the board, except to the extent inconsistent with applicable law. They never mention a theory. Or the trust instrument, these bylaws shall govern the board. The board shall continue as trustee of the trust with succession of successor trustees as provided in section 3 below until the earlier of the following events occurs. 1. The issuance of a court order terminating the board as successor trustee of the trust and provided for blah, blah, and the termination of the trust. Okay, subject to the limitations imposed by law, contained in the trust instrument to which these bylaws are attached, or otherwise contained in these bylaws, the business and affairs of the trust shall be managed by, and all fiduciary powers shall be exercised by or under the ultimate direction of the board. 5 members operating as a committee and deciding according to majority rule. Do you see that up here? That's the primary mechanism. There's nothing more important in Galambos. You can't build freedom without this. And these guys are committing a committee, and they're running it by majority rule, and they have the complete sanction of the goddamn flatland laws of today. They never extricated themselves from flatland. They still are in it, up to their ears. The board may employ one or more agents to perform any act of administration. So who's in power here? The board. Whether or not discretionary, including attorneys, accountants, investment managers, or others, as the board shall deem necessary or advisable. The board may charge the compensation of such attorneys, accountants, investment managers, specialists, and other agents against the trust, including any other related expenses. In discharging its duties under the trust instrument and these bylaws, the board may rely upon the advice given by professionals employed pursuant to this section. You hear the flatland crap in this? That's all it is. It's sickening. And I'm not a guy that's going to keep quiet about this stuff. I'm going to raise my voice. You know, they told me, why do you raise your voice? I says, why in the hell not? I raised it even louder. Why in the hell not? You offended the living hell out of me. You guys are enemies to civilization. What am I going to do? Be a little nothing? You want me to slow down? I can't express my emotions? My God. I'm harking back to an age when men roared, when they got mad, and when things were wrong. You heard from them. The awesome power of the male has been extirpated in the United States of America. In the heyday of the Roman Empire, you know what the law said concerning the power of a man? With respect to all domestic relations? There were no domestic relations statutes or laws in the Roman Empire. It was replaced by one single word, one single great principle. It was called pater familias. Pater, the patriarch of the family. He had the power of life and death over his wife, over his children. Only if he committed an absolute crime would he be guilty and responsible. But in terms of all of his domestic affairs, he was the law. And there was another principle in the Roman Empire that you need to know about, and that is called caveat emptor. You heard of it before? Yeah. That's only half of the story, so they told you a half-truth. That's a lie. That means let the buyer beware. Caveat emptor. You know what the rest of it says? Et vendor. And the vendor. Let the buyer and the vendor beware. Why? Because we're not going to protect you here with statutes and juries. We're going by the contract you signed together. And you'll have to live by it, so beware. You're going to be held responsible. You realize what that did? That got rid of all these squabbles and all this tort business where juries consisting of 12 negresses can determine whether or not the price was fair. It's disgusting. The awesome power of the male has been emasculated. He said it. The presidents, for Christ's sake, are effeminate, emasculated little fairies. And that's sad. And so when I raise my voice with these guys, they're so brainwashed in democracy, which means everybody should be equal and everybody should approximate everybody else, and any kind of emulation or inspiration should be horizontal, never vertical. And in a situation like that, the nation loses its character, and the men become women, and the women become men. And that's what you've got today. And that's what you got here. These little weasels, they're afraid to take a risk and make a decision and to stand up and defend the professor and go by the theory, and only by the theory, with no compromise, to the death. To the death. When Nikolai Lenin, rat that he was gathering recruits for the communist invasion of the most rapidly advancing civilized country in the history of mankind at that time, namely Tsarist Russia, which was the envy of Europe. People were flocking into Russia. They were putting investments in there. It was the United States of Europe. I read from Cunalt Ledeen, who is one of the great educated men of the world. He was 96 years old. He's still alive. I'd love to meet him someday. He's a nobleman from Austria. And he wrote a book called Leftism Revisited, and also The Intelligent American's Guide to Europe, because he's been everywhere and he's done everything. And he said, oh, if only you knew how grand it was to live in Russia in the 1880s. The balls, the conversations, the parties, the celebration of life. Well, this all got killed by a bunch of Jewish Bolsheviks. The first 50 Bolsheviks were, to a man, including Lenin, all Jews, without exception. And they were financed by the Jacob Schiff of Kuhn & Loeb. 50 million gold dollars. Some of you know this. Most of you don't. And because you don't, you lack motive power, and you lack the tremendous emotions of love and hate, which you've all been brainwashed to think is a terrible thing to have. You're not ever supposed to hate, are you? Hate is self-destructive. Hate eats you up. Right? Am I right? Yeah? Well, guess what? I had a lady say to me the other day, Mr. Martin, you certainly are consumed by a lot of hate. And I said, absolutely. You're absolutely right. Thank you very much. More Americans should be filled with it. There's a lot to hate in this country. Feminism, for example. Democracy, for example. The Jewish takeover of the monetary and credit supply. The pornography in the movies. The nihilism in the colleges. The complete erasure of any capital. The wipeout and transfer of capital from the middle classes to the Jews who control this country. Let's call a spade a spade. Wake up, learn this stuff. You need to learn how to hate who your enemies are. An alien race that's been allowed to exist within your national body. And you should be aware of this. But you can't do it because you're so damn brainwashed with democracy. You just can't do it. And you're weak. And that's why you can't live this theory. That's why you haven't got the motive power. You need two great forces in your life. Listen carefully. You need two great emotions, not intellect. Yeah, intellect comes, it's a dime a dozen. People can say, yes, I can define truth. Yes, truth is that which is observationally corroborable. Look at that. I can tell you what the scientific method is. 4 steps. Observation for purposes of data gathering, yes. Then you have formulation of hypotheses. That's step 2. And in step 3, you go to extrapolation. That's deductive logic. That's the 3rd step. And the 4th step is observation again, for the purpose this time not of gathering data, but of corroborating your extrapolations. And when you get enough of that, you have a theory. See how much I know? Yeah. Well, how come you're sending your kids to goddamn schools? How come you vote? How can you vote? That's a criminal occupation. You get into a shady-looking ballot box, and you hide out from the rest of man because of your criminal activity, and you take a X and you put it down. And don't you know that you're being stage managed by those who have taken over our country and created this country into a democracy rather than a republic, which was bad enough too. The republic should never have happened. We should have gotten a new king. That's what the French Revolution was all about. Elimination of the monarchy. Because for centuries, the popes and the kings had kept the Jews at bay. But when you have a country where nobody's guilty and everybody's guilty, that's democracy. You got a smokescreen. And the Jews hang out behind that. And it's their creation. And they said it was. I don't mean all Jews. But I'll say one more thing while I'm at it. I want this to get on a report. I'm sick and tired and fed up, so I'm going to say it. And then after this, you probably won't hear from me anymore. I'll probably disappear completely until I'm funded with money. And when I am, then you'll hear from me again, and we'll build freedom. We can do it within a generation, but I'm going to say this right now. Schopenhauer said that the Jew is the great master of lies. And Hitler said behind that, in Mein Kampf, those who do not realize the truth of this statement or do not wish to believe it will never be able to lend a hand in helping truth to prevail. Now, I am a very sensitive person, and I pay attention to that. And I said, and then I remembered, after viewing that and reading that, I remembered something that Adolf Hitler said to Baldur Schirach, who was the head of the youth movement in Germany in the 30s. They were having a gathering at the Eagle's Nest in southern Germany, in the southern German Alps. And Henrietta Schirach, who was the wife of Baldur Schirach, who was now the Gauleiter, meaning governor of Vienna. This is after the German takeover, which, by the way, unlike that propagandistic Jewish movie called the musical, what the hell was it called? The Sound of Music? You seen the movie? That's one of the most disgusting movies you'll ever see in your whole life. Great little love story, sweet little family, great music. But the Jews who control this stuff produce movies that titillate you, and they always deliver their propaganda. What was the propaganda in that movie? The most powerful message of all. The goddamn Gestapo, right? Huh? The Germans coming in there. The poor, hapless Austrians. And the stupid American public buys that hook, line, and sinker, and they don't know their history. The history, in the plain matter of fact, is they had a plebiscite on April 10th, I think it was, of 1938. Do you know how the vote went? The vote was, by the way, do you want Hitler or would you rather have somebody else appointed? Do you want the German annexation of Austria or not? Does anybody in this room know what the returns were? Would you like to know? 99.1% for Germany. The German Austrians had been completely plundered, defiled, misrepresented, persecuted. Same thing in the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. That was German country. The Germans built up the northern part of the Hungarian Empire. They built up Transylvania. They are the ones who created the breadbasket of Europe, for your information. That's the Ukraine. Tom Moore back here has told me that his ancestors in the 1790s, I think it was, Tom, you said, or somewhere along in there, were invited from Germany to go into the Ukraine because the Slavs couldn't do it. And the Tsarina, Catherine the Great, who was German, brought the Germans into the Ukraine, and what did they do? They produced the breadbasket of Europe. And then they were invited to go into the Donets Valley. Look it up on your map. It's to the east of the Ukraine. In the Donets Valley, the Germans went in there and produced an industrial zone bigger, more beautiful, and more productive than even the Ruhr Valley in Germany. These were German lands. They weren't anybody else's. Galambos taught us that property ownership, especially of natural resources, is based upon access. Access and exploitation. The Germans built up Russia, and the czars, going all the way back, ladies and gentlemen, to 1613, to Michael Romanov, who was the beginning of the Romanov dynasty, they were every single last one of them Germans, with one exception, who came from Denmark. Denmark is Germanic. It's all Nordic. Now, when I went up and met with Hayes and Joyner and Gafford and the other side, run by Cisco, and a guy named Turner, and another guy, I can't remember all their names now, but they're a bunch of weasels. And I knew it, and I saw it when I went in there. And when I was there, one of them, his name is Stu Stewart, something like Stewart was his last name. They said, Mr. Martin, we understand that you read a lot of history. And I said, not enough. Wish I read more. Well, this, what the hell is his name? Stu Smith. Stuart Smith. They said, we would like to introduce you to this man, Stuart Smith. So I said, pleased to meet you, Mr. Smith. And he said, and somebody said it was that big fat guy that, what's his name? Eric, who's the big fat guy that came to our office? Geyser, Jack Geyser. I'm going to put his name right into history. Jack Geyser said to me, he said, says to Stuart Smith, oh, this fellow Martin here, he's written a book called IQs, and he knows his history. And so Stuart Smith asked me what my specialty was. And I said, I don't have any specialty, but I am interested in learning as much as I can about Western civilization. I'm not interested in about Indian, North American or South American history. I'm not interested in black studies. I'm going to give a damn about the Orientals. I'm only interested in what my own race has done, the white race, which has produced all of the major cosmology and civilization the world has ever had. That's what I should learn about. And I feel sick about these kids spending hours and hours and hours in these goddamn schools learning about Indian studies and how they've been tortured and wiped out. Hell, there were more Indians killed in the Western cowboy movies than ever existed, to quote Galambos. So this Stuart Smith guy says to me, I said, well, what is your specialty? Tit for tat. What is your specialty, Mr. Smith? And he said, World War II history. I said, that's a very important and very urgent study to make. You remember this? Were you listening, James? You were there. Yeah. You know what happened after this. The room turned to total silence, if you remember this. Because I said, and then he volunteers. I didn't bring it up. He says, yeah, that Hitler was really a rough guy. And then it was like Huxley, in the 1858 showdown in the botanical building at Oxford University when Samuel Wilberforce said, "Hail me!" The religionist, Sam Wilberforce, he was the leading preacher of England. And he said to Aldous Huxley, "Tell me, which side, your mother or your father, have you descended from the monkey?" And Aldous Huxley turned to Hooker, I think it was, or Lyell, one or the other, and he said, "God hath delivered this man into my hands." And he said, well, let me think. If a man of scientific persuasion and achievement is invited to come to an august assembly such as this and makes a mockery and a rhetorical ass of himself, then, and I am asked that question by such a man, who's Samuel Wilberforce, I unhesitatingly vote for the monkey. It's one of the great statements in history. Well, when Stuart Smith said, well, what do you mean, rough guy? You're not, and I said, when he said, Hitler was a rough guy. I said to myself, he has been delivered into my own hands. I'm going to make hay with this one. So I said, using the Socratic method, I said, well, you know what? Hitler wasn't rough enough. He should have been a hell of a lot rougher. Hundreds of times rougher with his damn general staff. They betrayed him, you know. And if they had done what he said and marched as he told them to do in a blitzkrieg, that means a lightning attack, right through the Ukraine, which they took in a matter of days, and keep on going to the Baku oil fields to the northern slopes of the Caucasus, and to take the Donetsk Valley, with their blitzkriegs, they would have caught the goddamn Russians by surprise. They would have made it all the way to the Caspian Sea. They would have cut off the oil. They would have gone up the western coast of the Caspian Sea to Astrakhan, which was at the delta of the Volga River. And within a week, they could have been in Stalingrad. And you know what they would have done? They would have cut off the food supply to the Russians. They would have cut off all their industrial goods in the Donetsk Valley from them because they had taken control of it. And most importantly, and most urgently, and most critically, for Western civilization and all of our survival, they would have cut off their goddamn energy. And Stalin, in David Irving's great second book on the history of Churchill, admitted that if the Germans were able to take Stalingrad by September of the year 1941, they would have had to sue for peace. And you know something? The United States wasn't tooled up for war yet. England was completely prostrate with that bastard Churchill. And so, Western civilization would have been spared, and the world could have been listening to Adolf Hitler inform them of the grave peril of the Jewish presence, not only in Germany, but in England and in America. I give you another quote from Hitler that you should hear. It's in Mein Kampf, a book you're forbidden to read, in Europe for sure, probably here soon. He said, if we examine all the causes which contributed to the downfall of the German people, we shall find that the most prominent and profound and decisive cause must be attributed to a lack, hear it now, a lack of insight into the racial problem, and especially in the failure to recognize the Jewish danger. I'm going to tell you at full risk to my reputation right now, I put it on tape right now, I'm going to say he was absolutely right. He also said this, I hope I can quote it. I've got a pretty good memory. Here goes. I hope I get it. Warren, are you recording this? Attaboy. Whether one is considering questions of general law, get that. What? What? General law. What's happened to our laws today? They don't exist. It's chaos. There's no right or wrong anymore. There's no justice anywhere. Whether one is, Hitler now, saying this in 1924, whether one is considering, whether one is dealing with questions of general law or monstrous excrescences in economic life. You got it everywhere in America today. Everybody's busted ass broke. They're up to their gizzards in credit, and they can never dig their way out. And if they do try, inflation will kill that progress. It's a sad, sick love affair with the world we live in today. And you all know I'm right.